This evening we're very privileged to have as our speaker Ray Hulbert. Ray doesn't use his rank, but this evening I'm going to use it. It's Squadron Leader Ray Hulbert, AFC. Ray is going to be talking to us this evening about fighter aircraft from 1939 to 1945. There are a few of us in the audience, I'm sure, which will remember that there were fighter aircraft about that time, and they were our saviours. So Ray, without any further ado, I would invite you to talk to the club.
Mr. President, gentlemen, it's a bit of a shock to be called my old rank. I've never used it since I came out of the Air Force because I don't believe in it. But there it is. Probably a good idea, otherwise you might think that what I'm going to say I've read in a book. I wouldn't like you to say that. I was also told that there are about 20 more people here than normal. I thought that must be because of me. But then I was told that they'd all come from another club, so it had nothing to do with that at all. So there we are. The talk I'm going to give you tonight, a few months ago I was at an old Vizian dinner and talking to someone there. He said, look, would you come to the Aircrew Association in Birmingham and give a talk about fighters during the war? I said, don't be ridiculous, you must have tons of chaps in your organisation. He said, no, we haven't got one. Would you do it? I said, well, I'll tell you what I will do. I won't talk about the operational side. It's been written about and talked about ad nauseam. But if you like, I'll come and talk about the aeroplanes and one or two things that have happened in conjunction with them. So that's how I came to make this speech in the first place. I spoke about the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Hawker Typhoon, the Hawker Tempest and the Gloucester Meteor at that meeting. But I think probably the best thing for me to do is to talk about the Hurricane and the Spitfire, because that will probably be my 20 minutes and I'll leave the rest out. I think it's interesting to see how these aircraft came about. In the First World War, the Sopwith Pup was the first of the sort of post-war type of fighters. It's a biplane, of course, two guns firing through the prop, hopefully. Pilot sat behind the wings, good view upwards and backwards, which was essential on a fighter. The SE-5A and the Sopwith Camel came afterwards, same configuration. Then the Sopwith Snipe at the end of the war. The Snipe stayed into the Air Force till about 1925. Then the first of the post-war aircraft came into service, the Gloucester Grebe, which did about 150 miles an hour. Same configuration, two guns, cockpit in the same place. Various other types came, the Bristol Bulldog, and they seemed to go in increments of about 25 miles an hour. And all that happened really was that they streamlined them a bit more, and the engine manufacturers got a few more horsepower. They got to the Fury, which is the Hawker Fury, which is the first 200-mile-an-hour one. Then the Gloucester Gauntlet, all the same configuration. What we've got to remember is, during the 20s and early 30s, the Air Force almost disappeared. It was so small. So did the aircraft industry. So whilst we can say, fancy them not developing anything, that was really the reason. Finance, the aircraft industry got no money to develop anything, and neither had the Air Force. And so it went on, till we come to the Gladiator, which starts to come to the aircraft people had heard about. The Gladiator in its prototype form was again the same configuration, but then before it went into service, they lashed another two guns under the wings, which made it a 4-gun fighter, enclosed the cockpit and put on small flaps. I don't know why they put on small flaps. They didn't really have any effect, but I think probably the air industry realised that things were going to be a bit different. It would be a good idea for people to get used to one or two few more oddments to play around with. Of course, really on those aircraft, all you had was a throttle, a mixture control, a stick, and the rudder bar. So it was all fairly simple and straightforward. Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, came these two monoplanes. low-wing monoplanes, 8 guns, outside the prop so that they could fire, each of them fire 1,000 rounds a minute, retractable undercarriage, flaps, variable pitch propeller, and radios that worked. That was really quite an innovation and became very useful. As you can imagine, that was a terrific jump for everybody, going from these biplanes with nothing to work to these monoplanes. So it was really quite a task to get the Air Force transformed from biplanes to monoplanes. The first aircraft to come into the service was the Hurricane, which everyone knows what the Hurricane looks like, I'm sure. It came into service quickly because Hawkers had built many hundreds of aircraft in the 30s. The Hawker Hart and its variants, more than I think all the other aircraft manufacturers put together. And the Hurricane was built in the same way, with a tubular steel framework, with wooden stringers to give the oval shape, covered in fabric. The wings were aluminium extrusions covered in fabric. And as a result, they knew exactly the drill to build these aircraft quickly, and it also coincided with their new factory at Kingston-on-Thames, so they were able to get going very quickly. The Hurricane itself had very few teething troubles, worked very well. The only problem they had when in the early days, it was difficult to get out of a spin, so they got over that by putting a strake under the fuselage and increasing the size of the rudder, after which there were really no problem with the Hurricane at all. It's a first-class aircraft. It's my, I suppose I've always got a soft spot for the Hurricane. It was the first fighter I flew, and it saw me through my time with the 601 Squadron in one piece, which was always a good thing. I think it's interesting to look back on how we got airborne on these things. I went to Aston Down in August 1940 to learn to fly Hurricanes, because there was no dual instruction, obviously. And the instructors there had just come from France. They were 1 Squadron pilots. Some of them got DFCs, and quite a few of them had flown Furies in the aerobatic displays at Hendon. So to us they were gods with a capital G. And it was all very informal. Aston Down was a very small grass airfield. The dispersal offices, or whatever you like to call them, were tents. There were no such things as pilots' notes in those days, or if there were, we never saw them. What happened was they would stand on one of the instructors would stand on the wing, tell you what to push and pull, and the appropriate speeds for takeoff, climb, etc., and off you went. Well, that was a bit of a carry-on, because you had to go from this dispersal hut through 2 fields, 2 hedges, to the takeoff point. And that was a problem. If you went too fast and had a taxiing accident, you were in trouble. You'd do better to murder your mother than have a taxiing accident. That was the worst thing you would ever do. If you went too slowly, the engine overheated. So what did you do? You eventually got there, did your cockpit drill. I can remember what it was now. PRAFT. P for petrol, enough for the flight. R for retractable undercarriage, see that it's unlocked. A for air through, fine pitch. F for flaps, up, and T for trim. All nice and simple. Then you turn into wind, and at that point, better. But once you turn into wind, and the thing starts to get airborne, you forget all about that, and you realise that this was really an ambition coming to fruition. The aircraft took off in a straightforward manner, but then, of course, first time you've flown, it takes ages to do everything. You've got to get the undercarriage up, and on the early Hurricanes, that was a pantomime. They'd never heard of ergonomics in those days. You're like this, hand on the stick, hand on the throttle. To get the undercarriage up, change hands, select, press a button for about 4 seconds, then pump, and hopefully it was up. Then change back, by which time, if you hadn't tightened the throttle nut, the throttle had closed. Then you alter the pitch of the prop and close the cockpit, by which time you've gone miles. And this flight was done at 6 a.m. on a summer's morning in August. On the ground, the weather was perfect. Once you got up there, was a slight ground mist, and looking back, couldn't see the airfield. We got no radio in these aircraft, which was a bit horrifying. But I remember the Gloucester balloons were up there, so I thought if I get the Gloucester balloons over there and fly back, hopefully the airfield will come into view, which it did. And the rest of the flight went off without any problems. I just mention these things because the whole thing was so informal. No pilot's notes, no exams. You just got into the aircraft and these chaps told you what to do. Later on you have to do some aerobatics. This was a problem. I finished my training on the first course of Mars Masters. We did no aerobatics because the tails used to come off. This is perfectly true. In 2 separate weeks, 13 people were killed on that training school, not all because of the tail assemblies. I only found out after the war that what happened was they had a canopy that opened like that, and the canopy apparently blew off and took the tail with it. They modified it with sliding hoods, and that overcame the problem. But those of us who'd been on Masters had to have a do-it-yourself job on aerobatics on Hurricanes. So there again, they say, OK, go and do 3/4 of an hour aerobatics. So then you say, excuse me, you know, what speed do we do it at? So if they were decent types, they'd tell you, and off you went. I thought, well, a loop is a nice simple manoeuvre on a biplane. So I climbed to 10,000 feet, fortunately, dived down to do this loop, pull the stick back. You don't know what G to put on when you've never flown the thing before. And you get to the top, almost like that. With a biplane, if you pull the stick back, you go over. With a monoplane, nothing happens. There's a great juddering as it stalls, and there you are. And the funny thing is, when the engine stops when you're in that position, and all the dried mud comes off the bottom of the cockpit and gets in your eyes, and the odd pencil and cigarette packet places kept on the floor. But then you think, what am I going to do now? You have these ghastly tales about inverted spins from which you can't get out of. So I thought, well, the only thing to do is just sit there and centralise everything and hope for the best. And the Hurricane just dived out, marvellous. But I was down to 4,000 feet when it levelled out, so it's a good job I went to 10,000 feet, otherwise I wouldn't be giving you this talk now. Having found out how to do it, the next time was no problem at all. We only had 20 hours flying at that time because the panic was on to get pilots for the Battle of Britain squadrons who were obviously getting short. Later on, when I was instructing at OTU, they had 3 months and 90 hours. We never even did practice air firing. I remember the first time I fired my guns in anger, the noise and the smoke from the wings, I thought I'd been shot down the south. So there we were. And after the 20 hours, we had to report to the Wing Commander, Wing Commander Hallahan, DFC, another god with a capital G. Very nice chap. Just a young sergeant pilot at the time, and much to my surprise, he said, well, sit down. And he gave me a piece of paper, and he said, those are the squadrons, and those are the pilots, the number of pilots they want. Where would you like to go? Which was a bit of a shock. So I looked at this list, and saw 601 Squadron was on it, which was an auxiliary squadron. I thought, well, maybe I'll feel more at home with auxiliary types than regular types. So that's how I came to go to 601 Squadron. I had really no problems with the aircraft after that. Fortunately, they did let me have a few more hours before I was operational on the squadron, so I got a slight idea as to what was going on. And I only had one really serious problem apart from operations. When I had an engine failure, the Rolls-Royce Merlin was a marvellous engine, but I had 2 engine failures during my career. One was at 14,000 feet. The other was at 500 feet, which is not very clever. But we were doing a squadron formation north of London, we were operating from Northolt, and all of a sudden horrible noises came from the front and smoke filled the cockpit, and the engine, the temperature was going off the clock, so I realised something was afoot, something wasn't quite right. So obviously I had to turn off, switch off, throttle back, drop out of the formation. So I'd also got this temperature of 145 degrees in the back of my mind, which apparently the header tank solder or whatever it was melted at that temperature and deposited the header tank onto a red hot engine, and the whole thing blew up. So you've got a lot of things to think about under those circumstances. When you're in formation, you don't really know where you are because you're working to keep in station and changing formation, whatever might happen. But I knew we were at about 100 miles north of London. So if I head south, I'll probably pick up some landmarks, which I did. I thought, well, I should be able to get back, and it's much better if you can land either near or on base than somewhere else. The thing is, from 14,000 feet, it must have taken about a quarter of an hour to get down. I'll tell you this, it's a long quarter of an hour when you know that if you make a cock up at the end of it, you're dead. It concentrates the mind rather. Fortunately, the landing was quite successful in a field just at the side of the aerodrome, and of course you land with your wheels up. That was an Air Ministry instruction. You mustn't land with your wheels down, otherwise you'd turn over and probably break your neck and right off the aircraft. Of course, not very much damage was done if it was landed with the wheels up. I heard that my aircraft eventually went somewhere to be rebuilt and repaired. It was fitted with an arrestor hook and ended up as a Sea Hurricane in the Fleet Air Arm, apparently. After that, of course, we had a new aircraft come to the squadron. A brand new Hurricane, beautiful, Gloucester built, which we always reckoned was the best one of the lot. I thought, well, the CO will nab that. But much to my surprise, I was still a sergeant pilot at the time, it was allocated to me, so I had this lovely brand new aeroplane. But only for a couple of months, because we were then equipped with Hurricane 2, and all our Hurricanes went to an operational training unit, where I went to later on in my career as an instructor. And I saw my lovely aeroplane was still there. It had been taken over by the wing commander flying, which is not surprising. And every morning he used to beat up the aerodrome, do low aerobatics, until one morning he came a bit too low. And that was the end of my lovely aeroplane. So it's the only aircraft, as far as I know, I knew from the cradle to the grave. Now the Spitfire, super aeroplane, beautiful aeroplane. Anyone who's had anything to do with it, really, you can't help but like it. Beautiful to look at, an evocative name, it's got the lot. And of course, everyone's heard of the Spitfire because, not only because of its looks and what it's done, but it was operation from the beginning of the war right to the end. A very different aircraft at the end, but still called a Spitfire and still looked like a Spitfire. Excuse me. As I say, it took longer to get the Spit into the air and into production than the Hurricane, because it was not quite such a simple aircraft to build. It was fairly new type of construction, stress skin monocoque, etc. And of course Supermarine had only built aircraft in handfuls before, half a dozen here and half a dozen there, mainly small flying boats, like the Walrus that was used in the Air Force throughout the war on air sea rescue. And another thing that I think is quite remarkable, there had been one Spitfire prototype built, hand-built, and it went to Martlesham Heath. At that time was where the aircraft test establishment was of the Royal Air Force, and it was being tested by the Royal Air Force for acceptance, and was having some steep turns which gave a lot of G, had an engine failure, and this test pilot force landed the thing in a field without damage. Now you just imagine, if he'd written the thing off, we could have lost the war. I mean, in the Battle of Britain, 2/3 of the aircraft were Hurricanes and 1/3 were Spitfires. If they hadn't got that far, we would have been in a load of trouble in a big way. So that chap should have got the VC. But the Spitfire itself had a few problems, but it got into service fairly well. The Mark I and the Mark II. Now we come to a question everyone asked: which was the better, the Hurricane or the Spitfire? Well, all you can do is compare like with like. In other words, late 40, early 41 Hurricane and Spitfire. That's the Mark II Spit and the Hurricane 1. The Spitfire was faster. The Hurricane could turn in a smaller circle because it had a lower wing loading, and that was a very essential part of a fighter aircraft's performance. So they both got different attributes, and also the Spitfire was better at heights. After 20,000 feet, the Hurricane ran out of puff until we had the Hurricane 2s. When looking at my logbook, I see we did patrols at 30,000 feet, which was really quite reasonable in those days. But the Spit was went into production, and really until Castle Bromwich got weaving in the August about of 1940 in any numbers, very few Spitfires came through. Interesting, actually, the Mark II Spitfire that's in the Battle of Britain flight now and flies around on displays was produced at Castle Bromwich in August 1940. And when I went on a pilot gunnery instructor's course under Sailor Milan, I flew this aircraft quite a few times, which was rather interesting. It's still around. So a few years ago I rang these people up and had a very pleasant day with them and had a good look round and a good chat and sat in all the aeroplanes. Very interesting. They did have a certain problem with the ailerons, the Spitfire, but not at normal speeds, but in the Mark I and Mark II, when the speed got 400 plus, the ailerons started to get very heavy. They really started to seize up, whereas the Hurricane, right through its speed range, was light on the controls, very light on the controls. And this, of course, was a snag. Really, the problem was it had gone into service, like all the other aircraft, so quickly that they hadn't really had a nice long testing period. This problem was overcome when they fitted, and this was a retrospective modification, metal ailerons, and that completely revolutionised the rolling plane of the Spitfire. It was then light on the ailerons throughout the speed range. Super aircraft. The only other problem was they had one or two aircraft, the test pilots were killed with the wings coming off, and they found then that if the ailerons were not properly adjusted, both ailerons could come up, and the freeze part, which used to protrude underneath, instead of one coming up, both come up, and the strain of it just broke the wings off. So that they all had to be very carefully adjusted to make certain there wasn't too much backlash. As a result, there was a little yellow mark put on if you were testing Spitfires. If you saw the ailerons getting up towards that yellow mark, you'd throttle down a bit smartish and slowed down. I had an experience with a Mark 16 Spit, which was a Mark 9 with a Merlin, when they first had the teardrop hood, which gave much better visibility all round. And I was testing this aircraft whereby you go up to about 20,000 feet on a, it's all sort of laid down what you'd do. And when it gets to the top, you'd turn over and dive down. Diving down with this dirty great bang, because as you dive down, you sort of look at these ailerons, see that the yellow mark doesn't appear when the speed gets up. And all of a sudden, with this ginormous bang and the cockpit filled with wind, I thought, good Lord, the wings have come off. Anyway, I had a look and they were still there. And what had happened was this new teardrop hood had blown off. Again, a couple of test pilots had been killed when that had happened. But of course I had a quick look back. There was a great gash in the fin. So the thing was to throttle back and get down, speed down as quickly as you could and come down slowly. And I can tell you it was jolly cold. No hood from about 25,000 feet all the way down to the deck. And with the cockpit side was much lower when you had the cockpit, the teardrop hood. But there again, the aircraft was refitted with a new tail assembly actually, and we test flew it again in about a couple of weeks' time, so it was all okay in the end. How are we getting on for time, Mr. President?
You're right.
20 ton.
Okay.
Now the Spitfire, as I said, went on throughout the war, from Mark 1 to Mark 21, which came out just after the war actually. And the Merlin Spitfires were a delight to fly, because the airframe was really made for the engine and the speeds. Beautiful aircraft, right up to the 9 when you had all the extra power and terrific climb, super aeroplane. Then they fitted it with the 37-litre engine instead of the 27-litre engine. How on earth they got it in originally, I don't know, because the Mark 12, with the Griffin engine it was actually, the Mark 12 was the first one that had the Griffin engine. 37 litres, that's 3 litres per pot. And they managed to get this into the original Spitfire airframe, and it was used as a low-level aircraft. Clipped wings, 2-stage blower that changed speed at 5,000 feet. Marvellous aeroplane to fly it right down on the deck, just like a racing car. Superb. All the fighter aircraft in those days, when you took off, of course, the torque compressed one undercarriage leg so that you were going along like this. On the Mark 12, it was so marked, it was ridiculous that one wing seemed down here and the other one was up here until you got airborne, but it was a lovely aeroplane. Then, of course, they redesigned the whole of the airframe. It looked the same, but it was very different when they had the standard Griffin production job, the 14. Quite a nice aeroplane to fly, but not so nice as the earlier ones. Until they came to the Mark 21, which was the last one that went into service just after the war. Well, that was 100 miles an hour faster than the first Spit, twice the rate of climb, and twice the armament, so it was quite an aeroplane, but not very good to fly. In fact, it was a bag of nails, really. You were constantly trimming. Every different speed you had to trim. I was very interested to read in Geoffrey Quill's book, he was the chief test spotter of Spitfires throughout the war, that they had a hell of a job to get the Mark 21 into a reasonable enough condition to go into service, so that I wasn't imagining it, I'm glad to say. But even so, it was a marvellous aeroplane. Hurricanes stopped, and whereas Spitfire went throughout the war, Hawkers then went on to typhoons and tempests. Am I going on too long, or should I stop?
No, carry on.
You sure?
Yes.
The typhoon came in. Now that was a complete and absolute unwarranted disaster. When I went on typhoons, there was this dirty great big aeroplane which weighed 6 tons as opposed to 2.5 tons of a Spitfire. 24-cylinder, 2 flat 12s, one on top of the other, 2-stage supercharger, the lot. Had terrible problems with engine failure. And I don't know why this should happen to me. Terrible problem with the tails coming off. 18 pilots were killed due to tail assembly breaking. And we had the only pilot in our squadron who got away with it. He was an Irishman, mad Irishman I would think. I'm sure that he must have ignored what limitations had then been put on. But he remembers nothing about it. He was thrown out of the aircraft. They must have automatically pulled the ripcord. And the aircraft was almost chucked out of the Air Force. It was unfortunate. Again, not sufficient development work had been done. It was left to we service pilots to do it. And it really was a tough business for a lot of people. So we used to do a 100-mile sea crossing at 0 feet from near Plymouth, across the channel there. I can tell you, it's very disconcerting. They used to misfire as well as they used to. And it was pretty disconcerting. In fact, some of us were sent on an engines course to Napier's, and I think that was to give us some confidence. But to be quite honest, it was such a complicated bag of tricks, most of it came back that there's no possible reason why it shouldn't work. But they did get it to work eventually, and they found out when rockets came into being, they found it could be used as a ground attack aircraft, and that's what it was used for and they had this cab rank, as they called it, in France when the army were advancing. They had fields just behind the advancing army. There was Somerfeld tracking so they could take off from the fields. The army commander, if he was in problem with tanks, could literally ring back and say, you know, get rid of these tanks. The Typhoons were there with pilots in, take off. But a delightful aircraft to fly, and of course having been used to Spitfires and all these other things where you could see nothing over the front, you sat with a lovely windscreen, engines out here, marvellous view. Of course a tricycle undercarriage which was dead easy to land, altogether a very nice aeroplane, very aerobatic, very, very pleasant aircraft to fly. I think I've gone on long enough now. I can see a few people are really nodding off. So I will draw this to a close. I remember my last flight before I demobbed, 2 days before I demobbed. I didn't know that I was then going to fly for another 7 or 8 years on a Mark 9 Spitfire, and I went up and did a few aerobatics, a bit of low flying, came into land. No, I'll have another 5 minutes. I think it took me 3 times to actually get the thing on the ground. But no, this is the end of an era. Found it very difficult to finish. Eventually I did get it on the ground and taxied in, switched off, and the engine ran on, and it did sometimes, probably in sympathy to my thoughts. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Well, Ray, thanks very much. It makes us wonder how you had the opportunity to shoot people down when you had that much control in the aircraft. But I'm sure you'd be prepared to answer some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Has anyone got?
Did you ever have any experience of the Mosquito at all? I mean, it was a fighter bomber, I know, but it was quite a revolutionary...
I didn't fly the Mozzie, no. Super aircraft, though, from all the chaps I know who flew it. But I didn't fly the Mozzie, no.
Did you ever encounter Alex Henshaw?
Pardon?
Alex Henshaw was the test pilot at Castle Bromwich, because he, in his book, he encountered the problem he had with the engine failure, and they put it down to something called a skew gear.
Oh, well, there were various... I don't know what happened to my engine, because in the Air Force, the aircraft was taken away somewhere else, and you never heard what happened to it. But there were various problems they had, and as you say, Henshaw had 1 or 2 problems there. I know he had one force landing in the Black Country somewhere, didn't he?
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Ray, did you stay your entire war service in 601 or did you move about?
Sorry?
Did your entire service in the war in the 601 squadron?
601 Squadron, yeah.
601 all the way through?
No, I did 601 Squadron for about 9 months.
Oh, right.
Typhoon Squadron was 193. I did lots of other jobs in between.
Hi.
Ray, I'm not much of a scientist. Can you explain to me why the problem that you mentioned with the torque disappeared once you got off the ground?
Well, it didn't disappear when you got off the ground,
Okay.
but,
So what happened?
well, you had the full left rudder trim, and you only open up the throttle slowly. But why it was so noticeable on the ground was the fact that you were on the ground with 2 wheels and 2 oleo legs, and the torque compressed the 1 oleo leg. Once you're in the air, you did have torque, but I mean, the torque when you're doing, it all sort of balanced itself out as the speed got up, but it was the slow speed, plus it was noticeable being on the deck with the oleo leg being compressed with the torque, you see.
How did you find the Spitfire Hurricane compared with the 109?
With a 190? 109?
All the ones, actually.
Well, the Hurricane of the 109E, there wasn't too much in it really, but it was like this throughout the war. As I said, the Hurricane was slower,
Yeah.
but and then it went out of the operational side, and the Spitfire took over. But it was the 109E came out, and that was better than the Spitfire 2. Then the Spitfire 5 came out, then the 109F and the Mark 9 Spit, and they all kept on getting a bit better, and the other one would catch up, and so it went on throughout the war. But the Hurricane was really only operational in this country in 1940 and early 41. And then the other aircraft took over.
Mike?
Right. I think I've read somewhere that the firepower of the Hurricane and the Spitfire, though impressive, literally you could expend all your shells in seconds. I don't know whether that's true. Well, you fired, and I just wondered how if getting rid of all your weaponry so quickly meant that you could really be going nowhere if you weren't careful. How did you look after your... were you working for instructions?
Well, you did.
You didn't just fire at the first target.
I can't remember the number of seconds you had, but it wasn't all that long, because it was all done in quick squirts. You didn't sort of see the thing a long way off and then press the button. You waited till the opportune moment and a quick squirt, and that's really what it was. You couldn't have long, seconds of fire. That was how it was done.
So when you fired your bullets, was that it? Would you hang around after your
You never hang around. Very interested. The Air Marshal Sir Foxley Norris, who was a Battle of Britain pilot, he said that if you ask the average man in the street about the Battle of Britain, they say, well, it was a few officers who flew Spitfires and were very brave. He said actually 2/3 of the aircraft were Hurricanes, 1/3 of the pilots were sergeant pilots. If you were very brave, it didn't last long.
Okay.
When you're in combat and you're all buzzing around it all together, how do you stop from firing it at each other? It's very difficult. You move so fast.
Well, the relative speeds aren't so fast, of course, and I'm sure that could have happened on the odd occasion, but as I say, you don't sort of squirt away. You waited until you got whatever was the target well into the sights and then squirted. Hopefully you weren't squirting at a Hurricane or Spitfire.
What would the effective range be then? And what size?
200 yards was the best range.
And what was the calibre of your round?
303.
Was it 303?
Yeah.
How would that compare with the calibre? 20mm calibre?
Well, of course, later on they were, as you say, they were fitted with 2 cannons and 4 guns, and the Typhoon and Tempest had 4 cannons. But you still had the sight fixed for the best range of 200 yards. You've got to get in pretty close to do any damage, really.
John?
Ray, when you were talking about power failure and you landed and on instruction apparently you shouldn't lower your undercarriage.
That's right.
I presume you would lower your undercarriage if you'd actually got back to base.
You could do.
Would you not save the aircraft? Or?
You could do that, because it was so unusual that you got back to base. I landed in a field very adjacent to Northolt, but not actually at Northolt. And of course, what you've got to remember is you've got to get your flaps down, but when you're pumping them down, it takes ages. And to get your wheels down takes ages. And you've got all these additional complications. So the instruction was, emergency instruction, any forced landing, wheels up. Because the amount of damage was so small, really. Only the undercowlings
And the prop.
And if the engine had failed, obviously the prop of the engine going to be replaced, and the radiator, and that was about it. And when I had a forced landing with a Fairey Battle, and at the end it was actually repaired at the base I was at, and a fortnight later we had it back, new engine, all done, no problems. So that was the idea. If you landed with your wheel, in fact, a friend of mine, I don't know why he did it, but he forced landed a Hurricane with the wheels down, and it turned upside down and broke his neck. So,
No longer a friend of yours.
well, unfortunately, no.
Could you tell us, where did the Defiant fit into the sort of Hurricane and the Fairey Battle sort of area?
Well, of course, the
Did that
Defiant.
fail?
was a disaster.
Was it?
I mean, the powers that be thought, what a good idea to have a two-seater fighter. No guns for the pilot and the guns for the gunner. But of course, being a two-seater, it still only had a Merlin and, you know, gun turrets and God knows what. The performance was pretty lousy. They had one sortie, I understand, and a hell of a lot of them were shot down. It was such a disaster, they didn't use it anymore.
Well, thanks, Ray. The Defiant obviously was built in Wolverhampton, so probably that's got something to do with it.
I wouldn't blame that on Wolverhampton. I wouldn't blame that on Wolverhampton.
Gentlemen, the thanks to the club are in the hands of Dennis Daly.
Thank you, gentlemen. I don't know why I've been picked for this, because I was an LAC.
That's the reason.
Probably. Funnily enough, talking to Ray, I also served some time at Northolt. And more than served time. The flight sergeant said to me one day, I was on crash cruise, by the way, and the flight sergeant said to me one day, paint the mess room. So, and everything's painted Air Force blue. So I said, yes, okay, flight sergeant, what colour would you like it painted? And he said, bloody pink and white stripes, what colour do you think? I wasn't paid to think, so I painted everything pink and white stripes. And I got 21 days. But Ray's War, I watched from the ground in London for probably 1940-41. I was evacuated in 1941. And I used to sit on the fence and watch the dog fights. And they were hairy. And used to sit there and cheer when the one came down and it was the right one. And then they evacuated me and I didn't see any more until we came back to London and the doodlebugs were dropping. And I think they were even worse, because as soon as the engine cut out, you ran down the shelter. And so it went on. But thanks to Ray, I'm still here, and most of you are still here. So would you thank Ray in the usual way?